Okay, so I just wanted to review what we talked about last week, which has to do with the landscape. And the first thing you have to do is to make sure you have a white paper and you divide that white paper into 4 equal quarters. Now I do want you to notice that the paper is oriented so it is in landscape mode, so it is a horizontal orientation of the paper. And I am measuring that just to make sure it's precise, to make sure that I have the paper divided equally in halves, both horizontally and vertically. And I would refrain from folding it, so please do not fold. I'd rather you just draw it. Folding can lead to problems later on, especially if you're trying to use a ruler and the fold keeps folding up. So that's why I would prefer you to just draw it out. Numbering each rectangle, so it's 1 through 4. And we are only working in box number 1 today. You may already have done the outline for box number 1, but I'm just reviewing. So here this is in time lapse, the outline of the landscape. You're welcome to copy from mine. The picture I use is also in landscape references in Google Classroom. There's a couple other pictures there if you'd prefer to do a different one. You've been watching me working on the foreground. So the foreground is that front area of the drawing. I do want to point out that the trees in the foreground do need to be darker than the trees that are going to be off in the distance. And it is important that if you have trees that are farther back, they should get smaller. So I'm looking at my photograph and trying to transfer it into kind of black and white in my mind. There are areas of shadow, but generally as things go back, they're going to get lighter. Now that can also change though during, like with certain light patterns, as is the case with the drawing I'm working on. The grass up front is lighter than the shadow that's cast on the mountain side, but the mountain itself will get pretty light. So remember, there are some key things that will help with conveying depth or distance, this idea of space. So one of those things is that a concept of diminution, where objects get smaller the farther back they go. Objects also tend to get lighter or paler the farther back they get. And using overlap to convey spatial relationships can help. So I'm thinking of all those things while I'm drawing. I'm trying to do that. So for example, like the trees in the foreground, they're overlapping the distant mountains. You'll see that I'm intentionally using hatching and cross-hatching on here. That's a stylistic choice. It's a choice that I'm making as an artist. You don't necessarily have to. A lot of artists do when they're doing these small sketches. They'll use some form of hatching or cross-hatch. So it's optional, but it can look really cool, and it can help suggest like the volume of an object because you're wrapping kind of those contour lines around the object. And it was trying to replicate grass in the foreground, so trying to get that texture of all those grass stems. So the water is important. It is darker at the foreground, so at the bottom of the paper, and then it gets a little bit lighter as it moves back towards that mountain. Now on this particular mountain, there were all these different shadow shapes in there, and there was some snowdrifts, so I'm outlining those too. And of course, there are all these funky, irregular shapes. So I'm taking my time. You'll see that I'm using a lot of continuous line drawing. So when I put my pencil down, I don't lift up a ton. I mean, I do every now and then, but it helps me to get the shape of objects. You're going to see that later on when we do our more complex linear perspective when I do trees. Whenever I do trees, I almost always do one long continuous line, which if you'll remember, it's when you put your pencil down on the paper, you don't lift up until you're done. And the idea is your eye is kind of tracing along the edge of the shape at the same rate as your pencil. So it's really more about looking at the object than about looking at your paper. So there is quite a bit of detail in those mountains. You might have some detail on yours too. And then you have to be very careful when you're shading the mountains. You want those to read as light. So I am intentionally leaving a little bit of a gap in between my stroke. So your stroke is your pencil mark. So I'm intentionally leaving a little bit of a gap in between each pencil mark, so each stroke. And value is very important here. You want to get a range of values. Even the snow in shadow will have a value. It's not going to be blank if it is in shadow. And I am trying to keep all my hatching towards a diagonal on that mountaintop for consistency's sake. The main concept I want you to get is that the darkest values are oftentimes in the foreground and middle ground areas. So those dark trees that are up in the front, and then you compare those to the trees that are a little bit farther back in the distance, and those trees are a degree lighter. And then as things go back, they get pale. That's what I want you to show me that you can do in your drawing. And again, play with this idea of overlap, of one object overlapping another. And also, like, the details tend to fade as things go farther back in space too. So lack of details the farther back you go, you do want to put details though in the middle ground. And even on an area like the lake, there's still kind of a gradient. So pay attention to the value shifts, even if they are subtle. I want you to try and pay attention to those. And I'm sure you'll do fine. This is going to be fun shading it in.